Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting of the Education and Culture Committee in 2014. Can I remind all those present that electronic devices should be switched off at all times because they do interfere with the sound system. Our first item today is to take evidence on our inquiry into Scotland's educational and cultural future. This is our first evidence session for our inquiry, and today we will cover the themes covering higher education. Our focus for the first panel of witnesses is, of course, immigration and student visas, and secondly, tuition fees, and our second panel will cover the area of research funding. Can I welcome to the committee Gordon Maloney, who's from NUS Scotland. We've got Mary Senior from the University and College Union Scotland, and Professor Pete Downs from University of Scotland. Can I welcome all of you to the committee this morning, and also thank you for your very helpful written submissions, which you gave us in advance. I want to start off this morning, as I said, we're going to start off with the immigration visa question before we move on to tuition fees with this panel. Can I start the questioning before I bring in other members with a quote from yourself, Professor Downs, on the issue of visas. You said in 2012 at a Holyrood Higher Education Conference, "As I scan the policy horizon, it's hard to see a bigger risk or a more poisonous gun pointed at our collective success." And that was you referring to the policy on student visas. Do you want to expand on that?
Yes, I think the University of Scotland's position on the current UK immigration policy is that, firstly, and I think as my remarks indicate, we dislike the current system, and we've been lobbying for change for considerable time, again, as the timing of that quote indicates. We believe, and I believe personally, the current immigration policy is putting universities in Scotland at a competitive disadvantage internationally, and also that the current policy can change regardless of constitutional change in Scotland. It's not dependent upon independence, but it's something I think we need to be lobbying for. I could elaborate, but as an opening sort of statement, that's where I would begin.
Yeah, I want to ask you though about why you said it. I mean, what is the? I mean, you said it obviously. I mean, it's quite a strong statement. I presume you said it because of your view about the impact of the current policy on institutions in Scotland. Could you elaborate about why that's the case? So
the impact is multidimensional. It is both financial from a university perspective, economic from a Scottish perspective, and cultural and educational as well. There is plenty of evidence that supports the idea that the broad sort of cultural dimensions of a university, including its the breadth and the geographic breadth of its the students who attend university, both national within the UK currently and internationally, has a marked impact on the education of our students. It has a very clear effect, for example, on critical thinking. It brings thinking from different perspectives, all of which are vital contributors to the educational experience, both of those students who come from abroad and of our own Scottish domiciled students being exposed to that those wider cultural benefits. And these are not only important for their, if you like, personal development, but are vital skills required of employers. The employment prospects for our students as well are global, so ensuring that our students have a global perspective, I think, is critical to their future. Aside from the direct educational advantages, there's also strong evidence that says that the cultural and social experience of all of our students is perhaps as important as their direct educational experience on the programs and courses that they attend, and therefore, again, that the cultural richness within that environment is vital to their not just to their enjoyment of their time at university, but to their personal development. And then, as a final sort of cultural and social issue, our international students are some of our greatest ambassadors around the world, not just immediately upon finishing their degree programs, but throughout their lives, and form the basis for future interaction between nations. So I think this is really important. From a funding perspective, as far as universities are concerned, our overseas students currently bring £337 million per year in fees into our universities. And they also bring into the Scottish economy over £440 million in their expenditure out with the campus. So I think these, in summary, are the areas of impact that our international students have, and why, if we don't provide an encouraging and supporting immigration policy, Scotland will lose out.
Thank you very much for that. Can I turn to Mary Senior and Gordon Maloney and ask for the opinion of your organisations in relation to the current policy?
Yeah, I mean, you would very much agree with the comments that Pete Downs has just made. I think the UK government's immigration policy is holding universities in Scotland back, but it's also holding universities right across the UK back. Indeed, our three organisations gave evidence to the Business, Innovation and Skills Committee of the Westminster Parliament last summer, and again we were all three making these same points, and indeed these points were also shared by the BIS Committee of Westminster, and they had written to the UK government to express their concerns about the impact of the UK government's immigration policy on the university sector across the UK. I think the UK government's policy has a danger of being very narrow and insular, and you've heard from Pete Downs that it's not conducive with promoting a diverse cultural university sector for staff, but also I'd say for staff and for students. You know, we have concerns that staff are also prevented from coming and working in UK and Scottish universities in the same way that students struggle to get through visa requirements to study in Scotland. So, you know, certainly we think we could have a much better immigration system which would work for universities in Scotland.
Thank you. And from NUS's point of view?
Yeah, not to reiterate anything that's been said, because it's one of the few issues where I think NUS and universities in Scotland agree on the vast majority of things. But in fact, it's not just NUS and University of Scotland, as well as UCU, but even organisations like the CBI, which we almost never agree with, have been quite vocal in condemning the UK government's immigration policies. And I think, again, not to reiterate what's been said, but I think the treatment of international students in particular goes much beyond just the ability to get into the country. But what we're seeing increasingly is while they're here, the way they're treated is appalling. And there's been stories down south of students being forced to wait overnight outside offices to register, students being tracked, students being asked to come in every 2 weeks during summer placements to sign in. And I think one of the issues that we probably don't agree with universities on is about the role that institutions play. Currently, international students, during their course of study, can often be faced with fee increases that they haven't been able to budget for year on year. I was speaking to a student from Norway recently whose government were paying their fees if they told them in advance what they would be. But as they went to pay, check in hand, for their fees, they'd gone up by £1,000. And I think there's a role that institutions can play in creating a more welcoming environment for international students. But I think compared to the immigration policies of the UK government, it's a small one, but it's an important one nonetheless.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sure there are other members want to ask questions on this, but can I start with Liam MacArthur?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I will preface these comments by again reiterating my concerns about aspects of the UK government's immigration policy. But I was interested to see the figures that produced for us by SPICE, by the Scottish Parliament's Information Centre, which to some extent I found kind of counterintuitive, if you like. If the point at which the Fresh Talent Initiative visa came to an end in 2010-11, between that and 2011-12, one would have expected to see a marked reduction in student numbers. Now, the figures I've got here suggest that is indeed the case in relation to international students from Nigeria, from India. But overall, the figures suggest that we've gone from 27,880 international students to 28,500. Made up, I think, largely, it would appear, from students from China. And that trend appears to be maintained, while the figures for international students as a percentage overall has gone from 12.61% to 13.18%. And I think for the UK as a whole, it's 11.92 to 12.82. So I wonder if you had an explanation for that. I mean, obviously, the hope would be perhaps that those numbers would have increased more were it not for the fact that those restrictions are in place. But it does, in a sense, feel slightly counterintuitive to the messaging around this.
Is that for me? I guess that's for me, isn't it? Notwithstanding the fact that you've started to answer your own question, I would say two things. The first is that, as you rightly point out, substantial falls in students entering from certain countries that have been significant in the numbers coming to Scotland in the past, Nigeria particularly, but also spectacularly from India. And this, of course, narrows the base of countries in which we're recruiting students, which is not a good thing. In fact, the maintenance of the number at more or less a steady state relies almost entirely upon significant increases in recruitment from China, which is not a country subject to intensive scrutiny by the immigration people in Westminster. So I think that in itself is not a good thing. The second point, again, that you began to sort of to answer is that we would have been looking to see substantial and steady increases in our international recruitment during that period. And just to give you an example of what our competitors are doing, in Canada over the last 4 years, there's been a 32% growth in overseas students, nearly 23% growth in the United States, and again, very high growth in Australia. And these in part relate to the, I guess, the unwelcoming culture rather than any specific issue. But secondly, and really critically in terms of the competitiveness of our visa offer, is the very limited opportunities that international students now have for post-study work. A particularly good example is Australia, where they had a similar policy, actually, to those currently in the UK, but realised that this was a problem. And in 2009, they switched their policy to one in which was very both encouraging and supporting post-study work. And are now seeing continuous growth, with predictions of growth between 3% and 7% per annum over the next few years. So that's, I think, is the essence of what the problem is. And as I said, you partly got that.
Indeed. I mean, I've also heard you in the past talk about some of the risks inherent in painting a picture that suggests that, in a sense, the UK is closed to international students, and therefore I think the message there was a warning that we shouldn't talk ourselves into more challenges or difficulties than we currently face while trying to prosecute an argument for a change in policy. I mean, is that something that you still think is a valid concern?
Yes, I mean, well-publicised statements from David Willits, from Vince Cable, and the Prime Minister over the last year or so have said, Britain is open for business. And have said there is no cap on international students. But that's really, in a way, closing the door after the horse has bolted in many respects. There's no doubt that the presentation of a rather unwelcoming prospect has already damaged our reputation. So that's the first issue. The second, of course, is that in saying that, the student figures remain within the total immigration figures for the UK. And the current UK government policy is very, very clearly and very publicly to reduce those figures. And we have argued consistently that it would be sensible to take the figures that relate to student immigration either out of the total figure, or at the very least explicitly to state that the objective is actually in the UK to increase the figures that relate to student immigration.
If I could, just one final question. This is perhaps a little bit of a bear trap, but bear with me. Obviously, the Fresh Talent Initiative started in Scotland and ultimately was taken up at a UK level, perhaps reflecting the fact that one of the weaknesses in the argument of the Fresh Talent Initiative is that for a lot of those students staying on, the attractiveness was opportunities not just within Scotland, but perhaps UK-wide. Is there a sense that were we to have radically different immigration policies north and south of the border in the event of independence, the offering of Scottish universities in terms of post-study leave to remain may not be necessarily as attractive if it was simply limited to a Scottish context as opposed to UK-wide?
Well, I think the white paper on independence in one important respect coincides with the University of Scotland policy, which is that to maintain a UK-wide travel area, and I think that would make an important contribution to answering that question, if you like, both in terms of the potential attractiveness of the UK as a potential employer post-study, or for employment post-study, but also I think there are many other attractions of that wider travel area. So a lot depends on whether or not that such an outcome in the event of a yes vote could be negotiated, and that's not for me to say one way or another. It is just to say that regardless of the outcome of the referendum, University of Scotland would support the maintenance of a UK-wide travel area. Mary?
I guess your question about fresh talents isn't just about the ability of students to travel across the UK, but it was also because UK and probably English universities realised they were missing out on something, and that this was actually a really good initiative that attracted people to come to live and work in Scotland and the UK. So, we saw it as a really positive step that this was rolled out across the UK, and deeply regrettable when it was ended.
Yes, the scheme was withdrawn in 2012. Yeah, and it was picked up by the UK and then dropped.
Yeah.
Yeah, just for clarity. Okay, thank you. Just Mary Scanlon, did you want to go in?
Yes, please, if I may. Can I just ask you about the report by the National Audit Office, which found, after the new visa system in 2009, revealed that the UK Border Agency had let through between 40 to 50,000 illegal students, and also that they've been recently forced to admit that they have no idea how many fake students are in the UK or how many genuine students have remained in the country after their leave. So my first question, Convener, is was there a problem? Maybe it's been a bit heavy-handed in the way it's been addressed, I don't know. But do you accept the National Audit Office's findings?
My light's on, so this must be...
You landed with it.
Thank you, Mary. What I'm not sure of, without looking at the detail of the report, is whether that refers to all students. I imagine it refers to all students, not specifically students entering higher education institutions, which have a very high reputation for recruiting bona fide students. And my understanding is that the estimated figures for bogus applications to higher education institutions is a maximum of around 2% of the applications. So I think from that perspective, in the part of the sector that I have some responsibility for, I think the issue of bogus students is a small one. notwithstanding I thought you were going to mention the Panorama TV programme, which exposed some corruption in the English language exams for some overseas students. And I think, our question is really to the Home Office that actually verified the agency that carried out those exams, and certainly there are no implications of any impropriety from universities in that regard. So I think universities are in a good position, but I couldn't comment on the rest of the sector.
Can I just say it doesn't actually say whether it's higher education, but if it's not universities, are we talking about further education or private colleges, or I'm not sure.
I imagine we're talking about a lot of educational institutions that recruit overseas students, including those, for example, teaching English as a foreign language and those sorts of programs. But it's not really appropriate for me to comment on something I can't be clear on. So I will say nothing further.
Okay.
We move on. I think certainly Gordon wanted in.
I worry that this idea of bogus students is a bit of a red herring. But I agree that there is a problem. I think it's a problem of kind of unscrupulous private providers that aren't being regulated. And we've seen in a whole number of areas the problems that's thrown up. But I think this is one of them. And in the last couple of years, we've seen colleges in Scotland having highly trusted status suspended. And I think from us, there was a sense that was based much more on a desire to appear tough than on any kind of objective analysis of what was actually happening in these colleges. And we were speaking to the Home Office and asking them to come to these colleges and look for themselves, and they weren't interested. And thankfully that decision's been reversed. But I think there's a real sense that it stems from a question of perception rather than a question of any kind of objective.
It was the National Audit Office, it wasn't the...
Sure.
Yeah. Can I just continue? Professor Downs, I think you said something, I don't know if I picked it up right, but it was something about this could change under the devolution settlement, the immigration policy. Can I just ask if you've met with the Home Secretary? Have you put forward the concerns of University Scotland to the Home Secretary? And have you been met with an open or a closed door, I should probably say?
Well, first, if I could clarify what I believe I said, which was that the policy and any changes in the policy that we would prefer are not really an independence issue. They need to. The policies need to change irrespective of the outcome of the referendum. So just to clarify that. I have made many representations. I haven't yet met the Home Secretary, though I am attempting to find a means to do so. But I have met many other of the senior politicians, including Vince Cable and David Willits, and lobbied them both personally. And University of Scotland has written appropriately from time to time to make our views extremely clear.
Okay, my final question, Convener. Professor Downs, again, I'm sorry, I'm making you work for your money today. You did say about the UK-wide travel area in Scotland's future, here, which I have read, there would be a separate immigration policy, a much looser immigration policy in Scotland as opposed to the rest of the United Kingdom. And we have the United Kingdom, as it stands, and Ireland have both opted out of Schengen. So in the, if we did have an independent Scotland, you talk about a UK-wide travel area. I have the Home Secretary's speech here from the conference a couple of weeks ago, and she did say that there would have to be border controls because there's two separate immigration policies. Can I ask for your comments on that? That doesn't sound like a UK-wide travel area, given the two separate immigration policies.
My comments are those are political decisions for politicians to argue about. We will...
wide travel area in the event of two separate immigration policies.
We will, University of Scotland will, lobby both Scottish and UK governments to maintain as much as possible the UK-wide travel area. I would hope we'd be successful in those arguments, but time will only tell.
Just for clarity, of course, it's not a UK-wide travel area, it's a common travel area that operates, includes in Channel Islands and the Republic of Ireland.
Correct, yes.
Just from your own personal knowledge, Professor Downs, does the Republic of Ireland operate its separate immigration policy within the common travel area from the UK?
I don't know the details of exactly how the Republic of Ireland operates in that regard. I can easily find.
Does it operate exactly the same policy as the UK?
I don't know the answer to that, is what I'm saying.
Does Mary Senior or Gordon Maloney know the answer to that question?
It's opted out of Schengen.
That's right. It's opted out of Schengen. I'm just wondering if the UK government decides the immigration policy of the Republic of Ireland.
I don't think it does. I think that the point that we're making, it's going to be really important that staff and students are able to travel freely to Scottish universities, because universities are global institutions, both for staff and students, and so it's very important that that is maintained, whatever the constitutional settlement.
Absolutely. The point I'm making is that the Republic of Ireland, with its own immigration policy, is within the common travel area. So the point that was being made by Mary Scanlon is less than accurate, I would suggest.
I was asking a question, not making a point. It's just
if you wish to discuss that amongst yourselves, please do so.
Neil Biddy.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask about the post-studies visas that we were talking about earlier. Obviously, that was introduced by the last government and repealed by this government in 2012. I hope and anticipate that can be changed in the future. Don't think we necessarily need to change the country. I would agree with you on that. I just wanted to ask, is that in terms of concerns about the current UK government's immigration policy, is that the primary concern, is the post-studies visa? Is that the major issue? Because just following up questions earlier, it's not so much pre-study or visas to access studying, it's more the kind of the impact that the post-study work visas has had. Is that a fair assessment?
I think, to be honest, it's the whole package. I think the post-study work visa is its removal was unjustifiable. I think the hoops international students are expected to go through to get here, and then once they're here, are unacceptable. And I think the whole agenda has been driven not by any kind of rational analysis of social need or economic need, but again by a desire to appear tough. And something Pete said about including students in immigration figures, and it's an argument that's been made that removing students from that would be a positive step forward. I think it probably would be a positive step forward, but I worry that it feeds into this narrative of kind of good and bad immigrants, and that's something that we're really keen to avoid. And I'm worried. I'm reluctant to pick out individual parts of the UK government's immigration policy that are kind of worse than others, because I think the whole package is wildly in the wrong direction.
Mary?
Yeah, I would agree absolutely with Gordon. I mean, I think the Fresh Talent Initiative, was a positive step, and it was, deeply regrettable when it was ended. But clearly that was for students and then students following graduation. Our concern is also about allowing more staff to travel into Scotland to work, and we have members who are perhaps from overseas whose visas are about to expire, who are under tremendous pressure. And can't get visas renewed, and obviously that's the end of their livelihoods if they cannot remain in the UK. So, there's a real sense that the UK government's immigration policy is very narrow, very, very, very insular, and it's not of benefit to Scotland and to universities.
Yeah. More or less the same. The only thing I would say from a University of Scotland point of view, regardless of personal opinion, our responsibility is to higher educational institutions, and that's the only basis for me suggesting that we should take the student immigration figures out of the main immigration figures. There are all sorts of other sort of moral and personal issues around that, but I wouldn't comment on those.
Thanks, that's very helpful. I wanted to ask you about postgraduate students, and I know students from other countries make up a large proportion of the postgraduate student body. However, looking at some of the figures we've been provided, Wales has the largest proportion of postgraduate students in the UK at 41%. We have 36%. I just wanted to ask you, why do you think students are choosing Wales slightly above Scotland? What lessons can we learn from Wales in that regard? Do they have they had particular initiatives that attract them? Is there specialisms that that they have targeted? And what can Scotland learn from there, and what Scotland should do to increase the number of postgraduate international students?
One simple answer is I'm not sure I know the answer, but one thing that one needs to look at is a breakdown of taught postgraduate to research postgraduate within that overall figure, because that can make a huge difference in terms of the makeup of the postgraduate population, and also would lead to different form of analysis in response to your question. So, for example, if we were doing far better in research postgraduate but less well in taught postgraduate, where the bulk numbers tend to be, I think there would be a different solution to being the other way around. So I think one needs a deeper analysis, but I actually don't quite know what Wales are doing that is attracting quite so many.
I don't know. I don't have a fuller breakdown of the figures other than that headline figure I gave you. But I just thought it was interesting to raise that as an issue.
I think we're always looking at good practice elsewhere, and we shouldn't isolate ourselves from believing that Wales has got some interesting approaches that we might want to adopt.
It's also got a Labour government, I would say. But I would say that, wouldn't I?
Not for me to comment on whether that's got anything to do with it or not.
Can I ask, in terms of, we touched on FE slightly, I think we wanted to kind of discuss also the impact on HE and FE. I just wanted to ask you, the overwhelming majority of students in colleges are domiciled in Scotland, 98.5%. I think in all the last 5 years, and the percentage of international students HE is around 11 or 13%. I think it's the most recent figure. Just like to kind of ask your thoughts on why there's such a discrepancy in the numbers attracted to HE compared to FE.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a definitive answer to that. I know universities spend a lot of time and money and energy in recruiting international students, and I think it's not something that's massively on the agenda for colleges in the same way. Beyond that, I think Scotland has universities that are kind of internationally renowned and excellent. I think our colleges are excellent as well, but I don't think they have the same kind of international reputation. Edinburgh College doesn't have anything like the international reputation that Edinburgh University has.
I'm exactly that answer, really. The investment that universities place on their international agenda is very substantial, and the reasons for it are the ones I said in some of my opening remarks about the value of our international students and what they bring to the both economically, culturally, and socially to our universities, to the cities that our universities are embedded within, and to Scotland as a nation.
I guess, colleges have just gone through tremendous change from 43 colleges to the regionalised model. I guess there's also been changes in their funding. Some would argue there's been a cut in their funding. So I guess their focus has very much been on young people and supporting young people into employment. And I guess that may have taken away from perhaps some of the international work that I think was beginning to be developed sort of in the mid-2000s. But your question would probably be better directed at the college sector.
Okay. A note from the table that we've been given by the Parliament's Information Centre, the figure really hasn't changed over a number of years. It's 98 point something, and it has been 98 point something going back to 2008 is the earliest number we have. So it doesn't look as if it's shifted at all in terms of colleges, in terms of the number of domiciled versus international students. So I'm not sure that answers the question.
Yeah, I guess not. I guess that debate would be better for colleges, and to have a discussion about, do we want colleges to be attracting international students? What is the value? What is the purpose of college education in Scotland? And I'm not sure we're folk best
Okay.
to answer that.
Thank you. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. It might be helpful to put on record that if you haven't had a chance to speak to the UK Minister, that the European and External Relations Committee had Alistair Carmichael, Scottish Secretary, in front of him, and the issue of the drop in UK figures of 23.5% from India, 13.4% drop from Pakistan and 4% from Saudi Arabia was actually raised by my colleague Hanzala Malik with the Secretary, and he invited the committee to write to him with regards to those issues. So I think that was interesting to have on record in today's discussion. We've received a lot of submissions to the committee, but I was particularly taken by the submission from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which does cover many of the points that have already been raised about the lessons learned by Australia in reversing their policy, by its particularly talks about the inconsistency of the diplomatic and trade efforts being made by the UK. I think the term you used was open for business, and yet the immigration policy is seriously impacting on the number of students applying. But they also use the phrase, which has been used this morning, that the reduction in the number of international students also has a knock-on effect on the reputation of Scottish universities as internationally leading research institutions with partners across the world. Can you tell us, what does that damaged reputation mean in real terms for the universities?
Okay. Well, one has to sort of address the other side of that question, which I think I've done, which is what is the value of our international students to Scotland, so I think we've established what that is, and the range of areas that's important. And I think that a combination of the just simply reduced flow is damaging all of those critical values that we think our international students bring. But given that the numbers have stayed steady, what it's done, it's narrowed somewhat the spectrum of countries from which our students are coming. So it's having a particular impact on that sort of cultural diversity element of the value that international students bring to universities, and then ultimately our influence as a nation through alumni who have studied and become strongly associated with the universities, cities and nations in which they have carried out study. So that all of those things, I think, are crucially influenced by it. The final point is that our ability to grow and invest more in the educational opportunities for all of our students is influenced by our ability to recruit students from unregulated markets, with the fees associated with that, allows us to build and develop the infrastructure which benefit all of our students. So I think all of those are the issues that are affected from my point of view.
Mary or Gordon, have any additional comments they want to make on that one?
Just everything Professor Downs has said is true, and there's a kind of economic impact on it. But I think there's also a question of social justice. The students who are this drop in numbers doesn't just reflect the fact that it's harder to get in, but the reputation goes beyond that to the way students are treated when they're here, in terms of the cost they're expected to burden, the way they're treated from everyone, from employers to landlords to of course the government and the Home Office. And I think that's something that's worth probing, and it's easy to quantify the economic impact, and it's not so easy to quantify the detrimental social impact, but I think it's just as damaging.
Could I finally ask, I suppose we're facing a choice of two futures in terms of the referendum, but the Prime Minister has stated it as his intention, if re-elected, to renegotiate the EU treaties. And I was wondering if you had any inclination of what impact a major treaty renegotiation, or indeed the rest of the UK leaving, or the UK as it might be if we're still part of it, leaving the UK would have on Scottish universities.
Leaving the EU?
Leaving the EU. Sorry.
Two different things. Can I start with maybe this time? I think maybe.
I mean that's a huge question, and I guess we'd need to really think through all of the implications. I mean, an initial reaction is that I think the EU has been very positive for Scottish students and the various exchanges and programmes and funding opportunities that the EU provides to universities and communities actually in the UK. So, clearly there need to be a lot of consideration and probing of what is actually meant by a renegotiation or an exit of the EU.
Our relationship within the EU, I think, is vitally important to UK universities, vitally important to Scottish universities on several fronts. First of all, a significant number of our overseas students, but on a different funding basis, come from the EU as part of the Scottish funded component of the main teaching grant. They have exactly the same influence in terms of the cultural and social issues that we've already talked about. So any change in that, I think, would be of a negative impact. But equally, if not more importantly, our research interactions and collaborations across Europe and the funding opportunities from the various framework programs and the upcoming Horizon 2020 program are probably the only part of the externally funded research opportunities for UK universities that is increasing in scale at the moment during recession. Vitally important, and vitally important to the innovation culture of Scottish universities as well, because European funding particularly encourages interactions between universities and especially small companies.
I've got two members who want to come in. Who are the last two on this particular issue before we move on? Colin Beattie and then Jane Baxter.
Thank you, Convener. I think it was Professor Downs that touched on the inclusion of students in the UK net migration figures, and I find this very odd that students should be included in there. And given the UK government's commitment to reduce immigration, surely this is going to continue a downward spiral on overseas students coming to Scottish universities. It must be quite a serious issue. In your experience, is there other countries that have followed the same path? I know, for example, University of Scotland's done quite a bit of research on this sort of thing.
Well, as I said earlier, many of our key competitors that have well-established and internationally renowned higher education systems have gone in the opposite direction in providing encouragement for students to immigrate to their countries, in providing robust post-study work schemes and developing a national immigration culture that is encouraging and supportive. And all of these things are problematic for Scottish universities seeking to emulate our competitors, and we would prefer to do it in a more supportive environment.
Just touching on another part of University of Scotland's submission here, you're talking about the limited post-study work opportunities, and you give 3 examples of Canada, US and Australia. And looking at these examples, they show a very varied approach. And I wondered, do you have a view as to what the appropriate approach in terms of post-study work opportunities for international students would be? In an ideal world.
Well, we had a very good system that was withdrawn that I think everybody on the panel has spoken in favour of, and so that would be a great place to start, to get back to what we had, and to see that as a starting point for continuous improvement, and to see student immigration as a positive stimulus economically and, as we've said so many times, socially and culturally into the future. So let's get back to where we were and build from that, is what I would argue.
Assuming we did go back to where we were, would that make Scottish universities fully competitive with their peers elsewhere?
it would go a long way to helping us to do that, but we would still, as other members of the panel have said, still have to repair the damage that has been done by the development of policies that give the impression, however much attempts have been made to reverse that recently, give the impression of a country that is not welcoming to students. We'd still have to overcome the legacy of that policy.
So you're talking about reputational risk, or reputational
well,
risk?
As I said, I think the reputational risk has already come to roost, and we are rebuilding the reputational aspect as much as we can, and that then will be further supported by an appropriate approach to post-study work.
If Liam MacArthur is exceptionally quick, you can have a very small supplementary.
It's just on the point of reputational risk. I mean, we had this exchange earlier on, Professor Downs, but two colleagues have now referred to the reduction in international student numbers, and I think Colin Beattie just referred to the downward spiral of overseas students. While I would accept the need for a change in the policy and that there has been an impact on reputation, that reputation is not enhanced if one looks at the figures that suggest 27,880 in 2010-11 of international students were at Scottish HUIs, 28,305 in 2012-13. We need to put a proper context around this. What we've seen is a slowing of the growth and actually a failure to expand as much as we would like. But to talk about a downward spiral doesn't help in terms of managing that reputation.
I have not talked about a downward spiral, but remember, one needs to look at the individual countries to see some of the trends that are not helpful.
Appreciate that. Sorry, Mary, and if you don't mind interrupting other members of the floor. I think it's fair to say that the overall numbers have increased very slightly, but that is due, as I think you said, Professor Downs, entirely to the Chinese example, which
not entirely, but substantially.
Substantially, yeah, okay. As long as we're clear, but there's been a drop in other countries, so it's a mixed picture.
Yeah,
okay. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. I've just got two brief questions. We've heard about the risks to the university and colleges sector if a future UK government took us out of Europe, out of the EU. Would there not be similar risks if a future independent Scotland had to renegotiate its entry to EU and the terms and conditions that might entail? Would the risks not be similar?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there is, and the University of Scotland is concerned, anything that risks our membership of the EU and the benefits that Scottish universities derive from that membership would be a risk we would prefer not to take.
Anybody else?
I mean, I would agree with what Pete's just said. Yeah.
And just to follow on from that, Gordon?
No.
Okay. Do Scottish universities benefit from the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Service, which has 270 embassies and consulates around the world?
Well, having been on in the last sort of 6 months two missions to overseas countries and benefited from certainly from the work of the British Council, from events on embassy premises and other things of that kind. Absolutely, it does. That's a current structure that exists that provides us with sort of networks into many of the overseas territories with which we want to interact. That's the current situation.
Anybody else? No. So access to that structure would be problematic and would potentially bring risks.
Well, again, you're getting into the political dimension, which is your sphere, not my sphere. How one ensures that Scotland, under any constitutional outcome, retains the ability to interact with overseas nations efficiently and effectively on behalf of its higher education sector, it would need to be resolved, whatever the constitutional outcome.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to tuition fees now, if you don't mind, because we want to try and cover both areas with this particular panel. Again, if members indicate when they wish to ask a question, that would be helpful. Can I begin, though, by again starting with a quote, not from yourself this time, Pete Downs, you'll be pleased to hear, but instead from Alistair Sim, who said the legal advice we have received would appear to identify new ground upon which it would be possible for the Scottish Government to build a policy solution to the issue of rest of UK students coming to study in Scotland if Scotland were to become independent. That clearly, I think, is based on the information that you received when you asked the question about the possibility of using objective justification to maintain or roughly maintain the current setup. Could you expand on that position and the quote that I've just read out from Arthur Sim?
Well, really, from the University of Scotland perspective, there isn't a basis for expanding upon it, because what that advice also said was it was a preliminary advice. It was advice that we put into the public domain that was picked up by many, including the Scottish Government. And we made it clear then, and we've made it very clear since, that since the advice depends upon an objective basis for the potential charging of fees to students from, in our case, in the advice that we received from throughout the EU, other than Scotland, that it is for the Scottish Government to develop that objective justification. And we have lobbied quite strongly for that to be the case. We believe that a robust and legally defensible objective justification needs to be in place before, in the event of an independence vote, before the act that would create an independent Scotland is in force.
Okay, Mary or Gordon? Mary first.
I guess from the UCU perspective, it's really important that students from England, Wales and Northern Ireland are able to come and study in Scotland in the same way that we've spoken about diversity with international students. You know, clearly there's value to having English, Welsh and Northern Irish students studying here too. I guess, I mean, UCU opposed the introduction of the RUK fee when it was first being announced in 2011, and I think we really regret the fact that there wasn't a robust analysis and probing and argument around the introduction of an RUK fee at that time, and we didn't consider all the other options, because I mean what the RUK fee has done is introduced a market for RUK students into Scotland, and we think that's really unhelpful, and the fact that we didn't have any robust analysis of other options, some of which may not have been possible or palatable. However, we never had that debate back in 2011, and I think that's really regrettable. But clearly moving forward, we want to ensure that we can maintain cross-border flows in the event of an independent Scotland, and that English, Welsh and Northern Irish students are able to come and study here.
Okay, Gordon?
And we'd be interested in seeing legal advice. I think clarity is always a good thing, but I'd be very upset if this became a case of what we were able to get away with. And I think whether it transpires or not that charging tuition fees to RUK students in the event of an independent Scotland is legal or not, I think we'd still think it was morally wrong and unjustifiable. And you only have to look at down south what the impact of tuition fees have had. Just in the last week, we've seen the economic case for it crumbling, and the social case again is sketchy at best. We've seen double-figure drops in the numbers of the most vulnerable students, looking at mature and part-time students, going to those institutions. I think we'd be very keen to explore other options, as Mary suggested, that preserved access to education based on the ability to learn, rather than on the ability to pay. And I think there are two particular points two particular points that we were particularly disappointed with when RUK fees were increased to the level they're at now. And that's on protections on access. Even down south, even the Tories put in protections around widening access as a condition for institutions to charge the fees that they are. And we don't have that in Scotland now for RUK students. And as Mary suggested, the point around regulation is an important one. I think there's a very real risk that institutions being able to charge such variable fees creates a market for those places, and that doesn't benefit anyone.
Thank you. John McAlpine.
Thank you very much.
I just had a follow-up to just, if you don't mind,
Yep.
Chairman. Thank you. And it's really because I was sort of answering the specifics of the question, but I think it's important to state why it is that we felt it was necessary to seek a potential solution to the problems that were raised. And, and really it boils down to two main issues. The first is to maintain manageable numbers in terms of cross-border flow of students within the UK. And the second is that Scottish universities need to be funded for the students that they teach. And a combination of those two things are, to me, central to the thinking that University of Scotland has to how we manage the cross-border issues now and in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. John McAlpine.
Thank you very much, Convener. This decision by Westminster to charge these fees up to £9,000 in the European context, where does that sit? Is it normal?
No, I mean, I'd say that Westminster is out of kilter with the rest of the UK in terms of the fee level. You know, clearly it's incredibly expensive, and I think, as Gordon's alluded to, we're seeing that actually that system, it's debatable whether it's sustainable and is able to continue, because reports out last week suggested that it's actually going to cost the UK taxpayer more than the old system of much lower fees for study in England and Wales.
Yeah. Well, my understanding is that it's the English Higher Education Minister, Mr Willett's former political advisor, Nick Hillman, who's called for a rethink of their student loans system because the maths just doesn't add up.
Well, the report out last week was pointing out that the charge, the RAB charge, which is, I suppose, the charge that explains, that looks at the repayment of the loans, was getting to around about 48%. So the high level of default of the student loans was making the system potentially unstable.
Yeah. And so in the European context, that is highly unusual. It's our UK and in particular England, because I know there's different systems in Wales and Northern Ireland. It's that completely out of step with Europe in terms of the level of these fees. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Does Gordon want to say something?
No, absolutely. And I think the report out last week, although it's shocking and sad in a lot of ways, isn't surprising. And we were saying at the time that this model wouldn't work and it would end up costing more. And I think the reality is that they knew that. And I worry that when they talk about a review of student loans and a review of the way that system works, they're not looking at introducing something more progressive. I think they're looking at something much more punitive. And we've seen the sell-off of the student loan book. And I think what's been happening there in terms of education funding, in terms of student loans, and actually in terms of the stuff we were talking about before, in terms of immigration, has been driven by an ideology that's very detached from any kind of economic or social need. And I think it's incredibly worrying. And I know some of my colleagues were relieved to hear them talk of a rethink on student loans. And to me, that makes me worry more. So I'm worried about the solutions they'll come up with. I don't think they're the ones
yes,
we want
because
to
there have been
see.
suggestions that they might go even higher. Yeah.
Yeah.
But given what you've said about this unique situation in England because of the level of fees, it means that Scotland is facing a unique situation in sharing a border and a language with a country that is 10 times the population, 10 times the number of eligible students, but who face the highest fees in Europe. And obviously, would you agree that there is a unique situation there that Scotland has to protect itself against? Because it wasn't of Scotland's making.
I think it is a unique situation. I think all situations are to a greater or lesser extent unique. And it's not for me we've not seen legal guidance, and it's not for me to say about anything about the strength of the case for objective justification. But I think what is an important point is that there hasn't been a debate about this. And the immediate response after the introduction, after the tripling of tuition fees down south, was to move towards this model. And I think ourselves and UCU would have liked to see a much greater and much more in-depth discussion about what alternatives there were that do everything that I think needed to happen, and that was protecting the places for Scottish students, controlling demand, because even in a situation where Scottish places are protected, there are physical caps on the number of seats in rooms, and protecting the funding for institutions. But I'm not convinced that this model is the appropriate way to do it. And actually what we've seen in terms of numbers, I think will bear that out. We're only a year in, it's difficult to take too much from it. But if you take a small number of kind of elite institutions out of our UK figures, we've seen a kind of worrying drop. And I think over the next couple of years, there's a risk that all the questions that our UK fees at their current level were meant to answer will not be answered by them. And I think we need to explore other options.
Yeah, thanks. Joan, I think your question sort of conflates three things, and we need to think about them rather differently. The first is the actual cost of tuition. There was a cost to a university of teaching each and every one of its students who are there. The second is how we pay for that, and whether the extent to which students themselves should contribute to that, from 0 to 100% and all points in between. And the third is the issue of how one might support students who are asked to pay for their tuition costs, which is in England is a loan system which has certain parameters associated with it, which some evidence suggests are going to make it very difficult to be viable. They're three completely different things. So the cost of teaching students, I suspect, is no greater in England or Scotland compared to elsewhere in Europe. How we choose to pay for it has diverged very substantially between Scotland and England, and even between England and many parts of Europe. And that's a political question, how one resolves that. And the loan system is a thing again, how one supports students who are asked to pay significant costs towards their tuition. So I think we have to think about them entirely differently in terms of what...
Fundamentally, you agree with me that the English system of charging is unique in Europe?
Well, you're asking me to agree with you. I'm simply stating my position.
Okay, thank you very much. Liam MacArthur.
The Convener referred earlier to the legal advice that you took, which suggested this idea of objective justification might be pursuable. Obviously, since then, we've had the legal opinion from Paul Beaumont that led the Royal Society of Edinburgh to conclude we are, on balance, more persuaded by the opinion that suggests that it would be very difficult for Scottish universities to justify charging our UK students in the event of independence. We've also had a paper from the chair of the European Union Law at Edinburgh University, which concludes, amongst other things, the Scottish Government would face an extremely steep uphill battle to convince the EU institutions that it should be entitled to retain a practice involving systemic direct discrimination against one particular cohort of EU citizens. On the back of both of those submissions, has this heightened concerns within Universities of Scotland about the deliverability of a solution through objective justification?
Well, I guess to answer the last bit first, our concerns have been heightened right from the start. That's why we felt that we needed to participate in proposing potential solutions to the problems that you have just raised. But the first thing that I then should say is that the advice of Anderson Strathern that was given to University of Scotland differs from the solution in the Scottish Government White Paper, in the sense that the advice concerned the charging of potential charging of a fee through and justified through objective justification to all members of from EU states, all potential students from EU states other than Scotland. The proposal in the White Paper is to maintain more or less the status quo, which is that that is to charge students from the rest of the UK, but not from elsewhere in Europe. And that's a very important difference. So it's important that, that the committee is aware of that. The issue of objective justification and the points you made about direct discrimination. Well, direct discrimination is not allowed within the rules and regulations around student funding in the EU. But there are indirect forms of discrimination. And my understanding, again, I'm not a legal expert in this, but my understanding from the advice that we have taken is that a distinction based upon residency it would be considered to be indirect discrimination, not direct discrimination, and that would allow exploration of an objective justification on those grounds.
Gordon, do you want a comment?
I'm reluctant to get dragged into an argument about that specific point because I'm not a legal expert. I'm not in a position to say it. What I would say is that I think the overriding factor that we're concerned with is the political point about charging tuition fees, and we think it's wrong wherever it happens. And we've been vocal in saying that. Scotland isn't immune from those kinds of political decisions. Scotland used to have tuition fees, and I think that under whatever the legal guidance says, if it does transpire that it's legal, we think it's still wrong, and we'll still be arguing against it. And it shouldn't be a case of what the Scottish Government is able to get away with.
I don't want to kind of paraphrase a fairly complex document on EU law, but the chair of EU law at University of Edinburgh does tend to indicate that something more targeted under whether it's public health, public safety or public policy, something more targeted may be sustainable and justifiable, but something that goes right across a cohort would appear to contravene the fundamental tenets of EU law.
So the various comments and views that have been expressed, and also based upon previous case law, have tended to be around issues where the objective justification was based primarily, if not exclusively, on cost. Cost to the member state if such an approach was taken. The suggestion is that objective justification in this particular issue, as it applies to Scotland, would not necessarily be based purely on cost, but it would be it would relate to both a combination of the cost plus the potential for Scottish domiciled students to be denied significant number of places to study in their own country. And the rationale for suggesting that there might be an objective justification on that basis would be the very steep fee differential between bordering states, particularly England and Scotland, £0 to £9,000, together with the very large ratio of the scale of those nations, England being substantially larger than Scotland, as well as the shared language, a shared application system through UCAS, very similar secondary school and university structures. So any basis for objective justification, it seems, from my understanding of what has been discussed, could only really be developed if it included these issues that go beyond cost. But if I could just reiterate my first point, and that is it's not for University of Scotland to develop such an objective justification, it is for the Scottish Government to do so.
Just conclude with one final question on the. You talked about the different component parts of this debate. One of which, obviously, is the grants and loans, the support to students in order to sustain them through the period of study. I don't know if you had an opportunity to read Lucy Hunter's submission to the committee in relation to the issue of portability of that support, which, as I understand it, for students in England, doesn't relate to periods of study in, for example, the Republic of Ireland. You cannot take that student support out with the UK at the current time. Have you got any views on how that may operate in the event of independence?
Well, the only answer I can give you is that University of Scotland would support the idea that regardless of the constitutional outcome, that portability of student support would be extremely important for Scottish universities and in terms of, well, a number of things, but including the social justice issues that Gordon has talked about. But
putting yourself in the shoes of your counterparts south of the border, can you envisage them making an argument that would suggest that whatever funding pot is available should be retained within universities south of the border?
Well, I've made over the last 2 years, a year or so, 2 keynote speeches in universities UK, both of which develop the argument that the UK-wide system of higher education that currently exists, both in terms of the infrastructure for research, much of which is shared, and the reputational value of UK universities is something that both Scottish and rest of UK universities and university leaders should be vociferous in supporting. And so I'm just nailing both my colours to the mast and the colours that I have led University of Scotland to propose. I hope that helps.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up on that and ask, in terms of the work University of Scotland have you done any work into looking at if our UK students were to be given free tuition in Scotland and in independent Scotland, how much that would cost Scottish universities, the Scottish Government? How many places you would expect that to take up?
Well, obviously, you can come to almost any figure that you like, depending on how many students do you think will cross the border. We certainly believe in University of Scotland that many students would make the economically rational decision if faced with high-quality universities in Scotland, where no fees would be payable, versus paying £27,000 for a 3-year programme in England. We think that cross-border flow would have to be significant. It would be offset somewhat by geographic issues, reluctance to travel, the fact that Scotland has a different culture than elsewhere in the UK. Some may think it's better, some may not, other things like that. But figures have been generated around the notion that something of the order of 20,000 students might make that rational decision. If you adopt a figure of an average figure of around £7,500 per year per student on that, you arrive at a number of around a cost of £150 million. There has been, as a result of a Freedom of Information request, numbers have come out in the press recently around what I regard as a very appropriate scenario planning, where the impact of various scenarios, various outcomes has been analysed. It seems entirely reasonable that should happen, and you can just multiply the numbers up. If you think 50,000 are coming, then you'll get a bigger number. But my take on that is that it tells us the scale of the problem, and I don't think we should have our head in the sand. We should be seeking solutions.
And if it was to, given, say the number of our UK students is the number as it is at the moment, if those students weren't paying tuition fees as they are at the moment, how much of a shortfall would that leave in funding for University of Scotland?
I don't have that figure right in front of me. I can easily find it out. It would be, just trying to figure it out now, probably 20%. I think it would be something, several tens of millions.
Okay.
But again, I'd need to go and check the figure rather than be quoted on that.
Yeah, okay, that's, if you could, that'd be...
But it's a sort of, I mean, the more important question is, if the circumstances change, will those numbers change? I think it's most people would bet that they would.
In terms of, we've heard earlier about the argument about Scotland's unique position, and some may argue that, you know, if Scotland was to get an opt-out in this area, that there may be opt-outs happening all over Europe in terms of other countries that have tried to argue for derogation from EU duties in this area. Can you tell me, I think, are there any, in terms of other countries making similar arguments? Belgium, I think, and Austria have made, I think that was in the Anderson-Strathern advice. Is that still ongoing? Has that been kind of dealt with now?
I don't know if that's still ongoing. My understanding is that no one has succeeded in the derogations that you refer to. Can you hear? Sorry. But as I said, it depends upon the development of objective justification in the way that I've already talked about. And as I've already said, that's not an issue for University of Scotland, but one for the Scottish Government to take up, to produce robust and defensible arguments around objective justification. As far as I'm aware, the other similar applications have been primarily based on cost and not on wider issues that would be more likely to be considered to be justified objectively.
And just a final question, I think you've all kind of alluded for more detail on the legal position and legal certainty. Would you like to see legal advice from the Scottish Government on this matter?
Well, we're aware of the convention that governments are not required to release their legal advice. So we haven't asked the Scottish Government to release its legal advice, but I'm really not obsessed by that. I am concerned that the Scottish Government now takes the issue of objective justification and produces the legally defensible justification that we've asked them for.
But obviously, your advice, as you said earlier, the difference between the advice that you took before the white paper said that you wouldn't be able to discriminate between RUK and other EU students.
Well, what I said was that the advice we received from Anderson-Strathern differs from the solution in the white paper. Yeah. Now, I can't tell you how that solution relates to the legal advice that the Scottish Government has been given for the reasons I've said.
Of course.
Okay, thank you. Mary Scanlon, very quickly, Mary, if you don't mind.
Right, okay. The white paper states that retention of student tuition fees in Scotland is an appropriate and necessary measure to ensure Scottish domiciled students continue to have access to higher education opportunities. I take your point, Gordon, about tuition fees. Is it fair and reasonable to expect another country to pay tuition fees in order to give Scotland, if it was an independent country, in order to give domiciled students in Scotland access to further and higher education?
I think preserving access based on the ability to learn is a kind of principle that we should never lose sight of. And I guess as far as I'm concerned, that there aren't really borders on that. I guess my concern is this, that if there's a situation where RUK students can sweep up places, then it's students in Scotland that will, if that access is based on the ability to pay, then the kind of social mobility impact that will have on students in Scotland is an important point. And I think as I said right at the start, there were things the Scottish Government could have done when fees were increased to the level they're at. There are things they could do right now to improve access for students from the rest of the UK, and those are things we would warmly welcome. We'd be very happy to engage with. And there are things that need to be done to make sure that that doesn't have a detrimental impact on access for Scottish domiciled students. But I don't think those concerns are irreconcilable.
My question was, is it fair that Scottish students have continued access to further and higher education based on the ability to pay of English students? That was my question. Is that fair and reasonable policy?
Both on our UK students and on international students, where there's a similar issue, we are
England.
Sure, but we're uncomfortable with the idea of institutions being forced to plug funding gaps through students. We always think that funding should be it's public value and it should be public money, and we don't want to see students from anywhere. So whether that's mature students coming back for a second degree, or students from London, or students from Bangladesh coming to Scotland, treated as a funding mechanism, we think there's a kind of innate value to it.
I've just got one more question to Professor Downs. I would have preferred that he'd answered that one, but seeing as we're in a bit of a rush, just to follow on from Neil Bibby's point about, I think the word that was used was Scottish universities would be swamped by English students coming here. But in the university's briefing to the committee today, convener, if I can read this out, the places available for Scottish EU students are ring-fenced and cannot be filled by non-EU, international or rest of UK students. Universities have to meet target numbers for Scottish EU students and are fined by the Scottish Funding Council if these numbers are significantly underachieved. So my point is, are we going to be swamped with English students, or will these measures remain in place? And thirdly, do universities in Scotland, do they not decide, along with the government and Scottish Funding Council, how many are ring-fenced? What I'm saying is it not within your power to decide whether we will be swamped by fee-paying English students or not? Well, because the measures are in place now.
So, that's true, but again, all this relates to speculation about what would happen if Scotland votes yes, and secondly, it becomes a member of an independent member state of the European Union. And it's not for me to speculate on the pluses and minuses
these
of
measures to continue.
So they can't, under those circumstances, they can't continue because England would then be, well, not England, but the remnant UK would then be a different member state of the EU, and Scotland would be an independent member state of the EU. Therefore, without any change, and through the objective justification or some other approach to that, the students from the remnant UK would then have to be treated as EU students are now. So they'd be in that pool of students that are ring-fenced and and paid for by the Scottish Government. And we could do nothing about that as institutions unless some other another change was made.
Well, I'm just asking if the existing arrangements, which ensures that students are ring-fenced, can it be filled?
I know what you're asking.
Target. Now, I know you wrote it, but
And the answer is no.
While we have to, the
answer is no.
These measures would not continue.
No, not with respect to remnant UK students. They could not continue because they'd then be part of an independent European state.
So how long would you expect we've already waited over 2 years for minimum pricing going through Europe. How long would you expect to take the time to seek this derogation in order to force English students to pay
Well,
for
again,
universities in Scotland?
not an issue for Universities of Scotland, but an issue for an independent Scottish government in negotiation with the European Union. What we have asked for is that if such circumstances prevailed, that the objective justification route would be developed to produce legally defensible outcome before an act of independence was passed. That's our particular position on that.
Okay, just for absolute, it got a bit confusing there, but just for absolute clarity, I mean, I think I understand the point, but the situation is that it effectively the reserved places, the capped places, whatever you want to describe it, it cannot continue because obviously the current situation is that students from Scotland and the EU are part of that reserved places. Students from the rest of the UK are not, but once independence happens, then students from the rest of the UK become a separate member state, and therefore they're included in the overall cap for students from Scotland and the rest of the EU. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
That's correct, and therefore it cannot continue. So the point is that objective justification is the Scottish Government's answer to avoiding a surge of an increase of, how we want to describe it, of students coming from, for example, Newcastle and Manchester, where it's extremely easy to come to Scotland from, to avoid that happening, and therefore taking up those places.
Yes, with the one proviso that objective justification has not yet been developed.
I agree, but that's, I said it's the Scottish Government's answer to that particular question. Yeah. Thank you. We've got very little time and a number of members who want to go in, so we're going to have to be quick. George Adam, please.
I'd just like, thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'd just like to go on about the objective justification again. Where the robust case, the actual, and you're quite right, Professor Downs, and when you say that, you know, the case itself is the fact that we have such a cultural commonality over the two, the same language, the movement backwards and forwards, you can understand that that will be the basis for the justification. And with regards to legal certainties, none of us here are legal experts. You know, and even if you had legal experts in the room, we'd probably be here for another 6 months arguing over which one was correct. You know, so the whole point of having been in a licensing board in a previous life, I can understand how the legal system can even make things like that quite difficult. But that's their job, and that's what they've got to do. But with regards to that, is the objective justification, building the case towards that, is not the fact, the important part, which we seem to be getting lost, is that we are in an extremely unique position where we have the country next door that's charging fees, unlike a lot of other European countries, and we share so much in common.
Well, you know, we won't be in a unique position in the sense of European nations bordering other European nations with different approaches to higher education. But it does represent a rather extreme gradient in terms of the differential expectancy of student fee applied to students themselves. And as I said, the objective justification would have to develop that understanding, and particularly alongside that, the relative scale of the remnant UK versus the scale of Scotland, amongst other things.
George?
No, nothing else.
Okay, very quick. Thank you. Jane Baxter.
I'd like to ask whether witnesses have any concerns about the impact on the availability or cost of student loans under either a continuing devolution situation or an independent Scotland.
Gordon?
In terms of the report that was out last week, yes. I think we are strongly of the opinion that we should be working on a kind of long-term ambition of replacing loans with grants, and that would answer that question. But I think what we're seeing down south is one of the kind of reckless impacts of making kind of economic decisions based on a kind of ideology of kind of privatisation that isn't working, and we're seeing the impact in terms of student loans down south in a model that's proving itself to not be sustainable. I think in Scotland, for a number of reasons, the cost of repaying loans is substantially lower. Loans don't include tuition fees, so they're about half of what they are down south, and the repayment threshold is substantially less progressive, actually. And so whereas the cost down south looks to be between kind of 40 and 45 pence in the pound, in Scotland it's much lower than that, less than 30.
And do you think that UK or EU students should be able to access those loans if it was an independent Scotland?
So the Scottish Government is working on a project where Scottish students are able to access student support in other countries. My understanding is that the EU legislation as it stands is that you're not able to discriminate based on tuition fees or that side of things, but that doesn't extend to student support. So, for example, EU students coming to Scotland are not entitled to a student loan in Scotland. I think and very often will get student support from the country they're coming from. I think that's a model that it isn't necessarily ideal, but seems to be working.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
And finally, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Convener. I know we're very tight for time. I know this is a difficult session, and when you're being asked to consider all sorts of options, like Scotland being out with the EU in one hand, and then in the EU and in breach of EU rules on the other. But if I could run the scenario by you that Scotland is an independent country in Europe, as we can take from the advice of Graham Avery that it would be inconceivable that we would find ourselves outside Europe, and then the rest of the UK vote to leave the EU, where does that leave the rest of UK students?
Under those circumstances, and in no way am I suggesting that I have any sort of political view around that scenario. I think a quick rain check would suggest that they would become equivalent to unregulated overseas students.
I think that's what would happen. I think there's going back to the questions we were having before about international students and the way they're treated and the fees that they're expected to pay. I think that would certainly sharpen the point on all of those. But I think the framework is there.
Okay. Was brief listen. Can I thank the panel very much for their attendance this morning. And can I thank you for taking the time to come along and give us your evidence. I will suspend very briefly till we change over the witness panel. Our second panel of witnesses this morning will discuss the topic of research funding, and can I welcome to the committee this morning Professor Paul Boyle, who is representing the Research Councils UK, Professor Petra Wen from Queen Margaret University, and Professor Ferdinand von Bruntinsky from the Robert Gordon University. Can I thank you all for coming this morning, and I invite members to indicate if they wish to ask questions, and the first question comes from Claire Adamson.
Good morning. I was interested as a member of the European External Relations Committee about the Horizon 2020 funding and how much more of the European focus has gone to the excellence and the merit of the research that's actually been done. And I just wondered if you saw this as the way forward for research in Europe.
Thank you, Convener. I think one of the key principles of research funding, whatever the source, needs to be that excellent research is funded, and that excellence is a key criterion of making the judgment on whether to fund it. That's actually true not just of European funding, although it is. It's also true of UK Research Council funding. It should be true of any type of funding. I think in the recent funding of innovation centres within Scotland, that would too also have been key criterion. So I think it would be something that we need to see as being a criterion that's taken in common with research funding, whatever the source might be, because in order for Scotland, or any country, but in this case Scotland, to have full credibility globally in terms of the output of research, there needs to be a reassurance that funding was offered on the basis of the excellence of the proposal. I think that would be a common position of most research funding sources.
European 2020 funding is just one of the ways forward, because academic research is collaborative by nature, whether it's funded or not funded. And the research doesn't only stretch to the rest of the UK or to Europe, it's international as well. And I'm sure that the academic community will continue engaging in that wherever the sources of funding are going to be.
Yes, excellence has to drive all the research funding mechanisms, I believe.
And we're actually seeing examples of much more collaboration and joint research being done across institutions across the globe. How important do you think that development is as we move forward in terms of maintaining centres of excellence in Scotland?
I think research participation and research groupings and collaborative research across any boundaries, actually, wherever they might be, is increasingly a feature of the really good research that gets done. Very few high-value researchers now work on their own. I mean, even within humanities and social sciences, there is an increasing trend towards collaborative research. And I think it's important to see the significance of that globally. So we should, whatever system of research we're in, should aim to create partnerships both within our own system and outside of it. And that should be a clear understanding of all systems of research funding.
Completely agree with that one. At Queen Margaret University, for example, our research has been increasingly collaborative, and it's now 85% of our research is collaborative.
Yeah, I think in the UK, on average, it's about 50% of the papers that are produced include international collaborators. Projects that involve collaboration across institutions tends to do better in citation analysis than projects that are based in a single institution. So collaboration does seem, on a number of measures, to be a better approach.
Thanks, Convener. In terms of the UK research funding and the proposals in the White Paper, is the Scottish Government proposing to set up a separate Scottish Research Fund, or is it what's the position? What has been proposed? How would Scottish universities, what funds would they tap into?
The proposal at the moment from the Scottish Government is to negotiate a continuation of cross-country research funding. If that is not possible, the Scottish Government says it might be possible to set up a Scottish Research Council. But at the moment, what the Scottish Government and also University of Scotland are working on is for the continuation of cross-country funding.
Okay. And I understand that Scottish higher education institutions in 2012-13 secured £257 million of UK Research Council grants, and that represented 13.1% of the UK total, when we have 8.4% of the UK population. It's clear we access a substantial amount of UK research funding at the moment.
Well, there are two reasons we have to give first. The first one is that this figure changes from year to year, so that's obviously not guaranteed income.
Yeah.
And the second one is that we also need to look at other investment that RC UK is committed to, which is investment in infrastructure, for example. And if you look at that overall investment, that's just slightly over 10%, which is much closer to the 8% population share.
And what would be the impact on Scottish universities were we not to receive our current shares of UK research funding? Say that was to be cut. What would be the impact that would have?
Well, there are a number of things we need to look at. First of all, it is obviously not exactly the 14.1%, the figure that you were quoting, that we would get deducted, because Scotland does contribute in tax to the RCUK. So that amount of money is obviously available to the Scottish Government to use. And we very much hope that that part of that money is being used to support research in Scotland.
Can I ask the other panel members for comments on that?
Yes. Yes, the figures you quote are correct. Scotland does benefit from being part of RCUK, and I think the view in the rest of the UK is that we both benefit by having a strong UK research system, that it benefits the rest of the UK, it also benefits Scotland, so in combination we can do much more. There are many examples of that. Having a large funding organisations allow you to invest in big science in a way that would be more challenging to do if there was a separate, smaller research funding organisation. But, of course, this is to be negotiated. I think as I understand it, the Scottish Government view is that they would wish to continue to be part of the research councils as we move forward. As far as the UK Government would state, that's for negotiation after a vote, so that would clearly need negotiation.
Maybe I could just add something to that. I mean, I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but I think it's important to put it into a broader context. There isn't ever just a single source for research funding. So, for example, there's the Research Excellence Grant, which comes from the Scottish Funding Council. There are obviously the UK Research Councils and the grants that are received from that. There is European research money. There is now in Scotland already some indigenous, apart from Scottish Funding Council, there is indigenous research funding arising here through the innovation centres and others. So there's an overall package, and the UK Research Council income is one element of that. It's not all of it. I think it's important within that setting to say that if you are looking at the particular needs of Scottish institutions, looking at an element of Scottish research funding as part of an overall package is probably a good strategy overall. And so the innovation centres are a good illustration of that and should be continued. So I think if there is a discussion about the future of UK research councils post any vote in favour of independence, that clearly is a significant discussion. The Scottish university sector is very clear on its desire to remain part of that particular pool. But it's not the only issue that arises in terms of research funding.
Just for information, I mean, you mentioned it's not the only source of funding for research. There's the EU, the Scottish Funding Council. I mean, obviously, 257 million is a lot of money in terms of UK Research Council grants. What proportion of funding does that make up in terms of the overall research coming from UK research?
It's about a third, I think, if I remember correctly. I think there are different ways of handling this sort of agenda. I mean, for example, I wouldn't necessarily agree that you can only have big ticket science research funding through mechanisms of that kind. I came to Scotland from Ireland, where I was president of a university in Ireland for 10 years. And the research grants we received there from purely Irish sources would have certainly matched anything that comes from UK research councils. My then university received, for example, a single research grant from the Science Foundation Ireland, which was in the region of 35 million. So it is perfectly possible to organise that, but clearly when you're part of a bigger pool, you have opportunities, also collaborative opportunities that are otherwise more difficult. But there are different ways of handling it.
And just my last question, just on UK research funding and obviously targeting research towards excellence. We have excellent universities in Scotland, and there's obviously excellent universities part of the UK as well. Just want to ask you, how much of a proportion of the UK Research Council funding goes to UK universities? Obviously we have excellent universities in Scotland and the UK. There's obviously excellent universities in other parts of the world as well, but what proportion of the funding UK Research Council is through UK institutions?
We give all of our funding to institutions which have been accredited to receive RCUK funding, and that means that they are UK-based institutions. There are a number of mechanisms that allow us to collaborate internationally, but the majority of those would be on the basis of each country paying for its own researchers in that collaboration. There are rare examples where you have situations of some funding agencies in the world which do fund researchers in different countries. It does exist, but it is rare.
I was actually party to one such arrangement in Ireland. The Irish, US and British governments, in fact, set up something called the US-Ireland R&D Partnership, which was the UK part of that was Northern Ireland, and that's still running, and it's funded by all three jurisdictions. The scientists or academics who draw research from grants from that can do so without there being a calculation as to whether that particular jurisdiction's input has been exhausted as part of that. So there are. I mean, I agree that it's a rare kind of. Doesn't exist in many contexts, but it's not unknown.
Thanks very much.
It's, on that particular point about cross-border funding and cooperation, there's an example of the Swiss National Science Foundation, the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council and the UK Economic and Social Research Council collaborating. You yourself, Mr Boyle, when talking about this, were quoted as saying, addressing the major global societal challenges requires collaboration across disciplines and national boundaries. I hope this will be the first of several and other sister agencies internationally. So clearly there is not only cooperation and collaboration, but access to funding across these boundaries, including with the UK research councils. That's correct, isn't it?
What I stated in my quote is absolutely correct. I strongly support that collaboration. The examples you've given me are examples where we have what are called virtual common pots. And a virtual common pot means that there's a collaboration. You agree that there will be funding agreed across a number of countries, but that each country funds the researchers in their own country. We run, for example, at the Economic and Research Council, an arrangement that involves the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Americans and ourselves. But every time we run that call for funding, we fund our own researchers. So one of the challenges, for example, to that particular scheme is the Netherlands is the smallest country. So when we rank all the proposals, if the Netherlands are involved in any proposal, their funding tends to run out sooner than the other countries. So it does lead to challenges.
Okay, thank you. Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Fiona. Before I ask a question, in light of what's been said before, I'd just like to point out that the UK Government's paper, Scotland Analysis, Science and Research, specifically acknowledges that negotiation of continued arrangements is possible. It doesn't say it will, but it is possible. So, that's useful to know. I've just been looking at some of the issues around the EU and looking at, for example, research income to colleges, which is relatively small, and EU research contracts to the university sector, which run at 62 million in 2011-12. Universities Scotland have emphasised how important any constitutional settlement is that provides for continued EU membership. Is there not a concern among the university sector about the possibility that in 2017 the United Kingdom might pull out of the EU, and what would the implications be?
Well, yes, there is a concern. We very much would like to stay within the EU. There's no doubt about it, but we can't predict the future.
Yeah, I think I would share that view. I mean, you actually have a pretty international panel here because they're representing 3 or 4. In my case, I represent 2 countries. But clearly, the international network of academic endeavour, it's not just research, but generally is important, and it has found a particular context within the European Union. I'd have to say I'd be pretty, just purely now from the point of view of universities and their position, I'd be pretty alarmed if we were not inside the European Union.
That certainly seems to be a well-held view. What about the scenario if, assuming a yes vote in September, Scotland remains within the EU and the rest of the United Kingdom withdraw?
It's a nightmare scenario, that. It will be very difficult to address some of the issues that flow from that. And you've already heard that in the previous panel session, some of the issues that would arise there. It would be a very difficult situation to negotiate.
In terms of commenting on concern in the Scottish university sector, there have been anecdotes in the papers as well that maybe Scotland does not attract talent anymore from other countries because researchers are worried about the future in terms of EU, in terms of research funding and so on. That does not seem to be the case. So I've asked around other universities as well, and including in my own university, we've attracted really excellent researchers from Ireland and from England just recently who made the positive choice to come to Scotland.
So there's no impact at this point that the Scottish referendum is affecting people choosing to come to Scotland?
Not at all. I mean, pre-REF exercise, yes, there was the usual change of professors and research from one university to another, but which is normal, but it wasn't one-sided. And post-REF in particular, I've seen an influx of researchers coming to Scotland. Anecdotally, and that is anecdotally, when I go down to UK and speak to English researchers, increasingly I hear, I wish I worked in Scotland. So why? They feel that the Scottish landscape, in terms of higher education, is more sympathetic to the value of education to a country.
I would add to that, maybe it's seen as a fairly stable setting. I mean, notwithstanding the referendum issue, I would agree with Petra. I think there is no evidence, whatever one's views on the referendum might be, there is no evidence that this has a negative impact on our capacity to employ globally, not just from the rest of the UK, because I think that continues. I've certainly noticed no change in recent job application patterns there, nor outside of the UK, nor indeed outside of Europe. So there is, in fact, one possible analysis one could make is that the discussions, which have been increasingly global about Scotland's future, have created a profile for Scotland and made people aware of it in a way that might, in some respects, actually help.
Okay, thank you. Liam MacArthur.
Just to be clear, it's probably more for Professor Boyle. The examples of precedents of countries funding to any large-scale research out with their borders is limited. Is that?
Yes, there are examples. So the Wellcome Trust as a charity, for example, a very large funding charity, does allow Ireland to compete for its resources, but it has a different arrangement with Ireland, so Ireland has to match the funding that the Wellcome Trust puts up. So charities, of course, are in a different position. They're not government-owned funding agencies, which would be rather different. It certainly is the case that the number of cases where funding agencies that fund outside their border, national sort of government-led funding agencies, is extremely rare. But it does exist. There are some examples, but very rare.
And I mean, I think quite rightly, all three of you have laid heavy emphasis on the importance of collaboration internationally as well as domestically, and the value both to Scottish institutions, but also institutions south of the border, of the way in which that ecosystem, I think Professor Downs has referred to it in the past, research ecosystem operates. So I can appreciate certainly in the short term there would be a mutual interest in maintaining that. I suppose the question is over the slightly more medium to longer term, where you have such an imbalance in terms of relative size, where you've got an imbalance at the moment with Scottish institutions punching above their weight in terms of the amount of research funding they attract from the UK Research Council, that there may be a gravitational pull of either individuals or teams of individuals with pressure increasing to retain more of that funding within a continuing UK, as opposed to dispersing it across what would effectively be a border at that stage.
I think maybe that will depend a little bit on what the experience with the outputs from the research would be. I mean, clearly, collaborative research across boundaries benefits those on either side of those boundaries. And if that's seen to be the case, both in terms of the profile of the research and the reputation building that goes on with the institutions, but perhaps also in the extent to which that research then has an impact on things like economic development and so on. And if that is reasonably balanced, then those pressures might not exist. But obviously, none of us can tell the future.
I mean, I think what I was probably driving at was Professor Boyle's analysis of how that collaboration works at the moment, where effectively everybody pitches in, but everybody pitches in at pretty much an approximate of their relative size and scale to that collaborative effort. And therefore, where you see Scottish institutions, for quite understandable reasons, punching above our weight within a UK context, is there not, I suppose, precedent for suggesting that even were that ecosystem to remain in place, what you would see is more a levelling out, where the Scottish Government in an independent Scotland would be expected, or the Research Council at the Scottish level would be expected to shoulder more of a kind of approximation of the cost, whether that's around 9% of the cost, as opposed to what we're attracted from the Council at the moment.
I think there clearly would need to be a negotiation. If Scotland were to want to retain its position within a sort of single research ecosystem, which of course we strongly support, because I think there are a whole series of advantages to that. I mentioned the scale advantage, which I do still believe is an advantage. There are other advantages to a single research system, which is that you have a single process of peer review. There's all sorts of other added efficiencies that work in that system. But of course, if Scotland were to decide to vote for independence, then clearly there'd have to be a negotiation about how Scotland would stay in that system. And of course, one would presume that the Scottish Government would want to think carefully about its own research priorities and so on within any new system that's established afterwards. So there'd have to be a lot of negotiation, I think, about what role it would want to play in a single system, or if it decided to change its mind and go for a Scottish form of research council funding, which of course is another option that would be open to Scotland if it felt like doing that.
And I mean, would you anticipate, certainly either individual institutions or perhaps more widely, there being an effort to identify key research individuals or key research teams in an effort to poach them over the years after a possible yes vote in a referendum?
I think the research system is one in which universities are very keen to recruit the best people they can. I don't personally think that the vote for independence would change any of that. I mean, we, as you've already heard, universities across the UK recruit internationally, and they try and recruit the best staff that they can find from wherever they might be, and I think that would continue.
Back that, I mean, that's happening now. That wouldn't be an innovation, and to some extent, this has been influenced by research assessment exercises and so on, and there is a transfer market, and it has sometimes distorted activities. I would agree. I don't think that would change very much.
Yeah, completely agree again. Just to stress again the importance of negotiation, we need to come up with some kind of structure where people are happy on both sides of the border. But to give you an example how important the common research area is that Wales is happy to contribute according to the population, but what they get out of it from the research councils is less than what they pay in terms of tax. But Wales still decide to go with it simply because they see the value of the common research area.
Very much. In terms of this Scotland punching above its weight in terms of research excellence, I think that we're all agreed that that's a great thing. But of course, Scotland also punches above its weight in terms of the amount of tax that it gives to the UK Treasury, which in turn will fund the research councils. I think it's about 9.6% of the UK tax. What would be the effect on the UK's research councils if the UK government refused to negotiate with Scotland after independence and the research councils lost that money?
I leave it to Paul to answer that, but obviously the research councils need to take into account that that money is lost now and that there is a smaller pool.
I think, as I've stated a number of times, I mean, we're obviously very keen that that doesn't happen. We'd like to see a single research system continue, whether or not there's a vote for independence. But obviously, if there is a vote for independence, it'll have to be negotiated. You're right that we would, if we ended up with separate systems, it would be a slightly smaller system in the rest of the UK, but clearly still a much larger system than would be left in Scotland. And I personally think there are some advantages to retaining the size and scale of that system, because it does allow you to support things that are rather more difficult, not impossible, but rather more difficult to support in a smaller funding system.
So from an academic point of view, it's in the interest of everyone to negotiate?
Yes.
I think that would be a common position, and I would like to think it's a common position across the UK as currently constituted.
On that point, I mean, is the form of the Constitution in any way relevant in a sense as to how we set up our funding arrangements in terms of higher order research? I mean, I'm looking at a quote from the principal of Edinburgh University, Tim O'Shea, where he said, "There is no reason why any form of constitutional change should preclude participation in higher order research councils." Would you agree with Tim O'Shea?
I think clearly, if there's a new constitution, then all elements of society need some very careful thought. And one of the issues around research funding, as you'll know, in the UK we do have something called the Haldane Principle, which the current UK government has continued to support, has verbally come out and supported relatively recently, a few months ago. So this principle is a principle that protects research funding from political interference, in a sense. So I think, obviously, in any discussion about a constitution, those sorts of issues about the role of how much influence a political or a government should have over the research funding that nation is putting forward is clearly something that does need some thought. And personally, I think the situation we have in the UK as it exists with the Haldane Principle is much stronger as a result, and is one of the reasons why the UK punches so far above its weight internationally in the research that it undertakes.
Yes, but given the fact that the Scottish Government has said that it post a yes vote, or post-independence rather, it wishes for the current setup effectively to continue. So it supports the current setup in terms of research funding, with the Scottish Government contributing to that. That would seem to me suggest extremely strongly that effectively, not ignoring the fact there would have to be negotiations, that effectively there is a positive will there to carry on with exactly the principles that you're talking about.
Yes, I mean, but as I state, I mean, if you're devising a constitution, then you would need to think about the principles around political oversight of research funding.
And University of Scotland obviously would very much support the Haldane Principle to continue in Scotland.
Of course, yes. Thank you. Jane Baxter.
Thanks, Convener. As I understand it, universities currently maintain collective pay bargaining arrangements on a UK-wide basis. And of course, it's a UK pension scheme that's in place at the moment. So if we do end up with two separate systems, a small one and a bigger one, what impact do you think that's going to have on the sustainability of the sector in Scotland? Things like terms and conditions, attracting staff, retaining staff, and of course the impact on pensions. Do you think those things will impact on the capacity of the sector to continue to flourish?
Well, again, we probably would want to continue collective bargaining across the UK. If that is not possible, it would have to be done within Scotland. But again, it is something we need to look at, we need to negotiate, we need to discuss together with the unions as well. So it is not something we can just make up here on the spot.
I might have a slightly different perspective on UK-wide bargaining, but having said that, there is certainly a wider... Academic communities are global communities. They're not generally national communities. And to that extent, people feel a sense of commitment to their institution, but also their discipline, their colleagues, their collaborators, wherever those might be. And so, and that's the case throughout, across boundaries and borders that exist at the moment. I wouldn't expect that to be any different if there were a yes vote in Scotland.
I think it is absolutely true that there are many mobile international researchers across the whole of the world, so this is clearly something that exists. However, certainly there is some evidence that suggests that while we get quite a lot of collaboration between European countries, for example, in research, we don't get as much mobility across European countries as we might expect compared to some other places. And part of the rationale for that is exactly the point you're making, that different pension systems and so on can sometimes be challenging for people to move around. But there's a range of things. It's not just pensions, but there are a range of things that can discourage that.
I mean, pensions are extraordinarily complicated. You have to bear in mind that there are some countries where there are different pension schemes between different university institutions within the same country. So it's very complicated.
Yeah. Within the same institution.
And within the same institution, indeed. Yeah.
I suppose the question remains then whether establishing two separate systems enhances that or detracts from that. That is the question, Convener.
Well, yeah, I'm sure we'll find out. Mary Scanlon.
Thank you. In the University of Scotland briefing for today, it does say, as you've all said, basically that successful negotiation of the continued arrangements in relation to research would be the optimum solution. But they go on to say the outcome is not predictable. Would you acknowledge the fact that in the case of a separate Scotland, we actually don't know, because it is based on negotiation. So we do not know whether Scotland, with 8% of the population, will continue to have over 13% of UK funding. Do you agree with the University of Scotland that the outcome of these negotiations, which are quite considerable, is not predictable?
Well, clearly, no negotiations are predictable in advance of them taking place. So that's always a caveat one has to enter. And indeed, and as Petra said earlier, there is no certainty, even if there were no constitutional change, that Scotland would always draw 12, 13, 14 or whatever % of UK Research Council funding. That will depend on the excellence of the proposals that are made at any given time and the evaluation of those. No future is ever clear, you know. So I think it was Stalin actually who said to a convention of historians in Moscow in 1948, he said the future is clear, it's the past that's uncertain. I don't hold that view. I think we always have uncertainties as what we are facing in the future. But I think the point perhaps worth making is that, leaving aside for a minute as to what governments are or are not able to do in any negotiation scenario, the key stakeholders apart from government are all pretty well agreed as to what this should be on both sides of the border. So I think, you know, as was suggested a moment ago, I think there's a fair amount of goodwill in the system, and I would hope that that gets reflected in the discussions that would take place after a vote.
I think certainly the view of the Research Councils, as I've stated a number of times, is that the system we have is the better system. I would caution that I don't think there is a single example internationally that I'm aware of a single research system that spans more than one country existing today. So that clearly needs negotiation, as you point out.
That's my third question. If I can come to a second question, it's about charities, charitable funding. And Professor Boyle, you mentioned Wellcome Trust, and I'm aware that Cancer Research UK puts considerable amount of funding into Scotland. For example, 34 million is Stirling University. Now, University Scotland themselves say the university sector will seek affirmation that the major UK research charities will continue to invest in excellent research by Scottish universities. So University Scotland are having to seek affirmation. So they are saying it's unpredictable what will be a result of the outcome of the negotiations. Of course it is. But they're actually going to have to, they're seeking affirmation, and they also go on to say, and would continue to research sorry, and assurances from the Scottish Government. So it's not just affirmation from major UK charities, which are significant funders in Scotland, but they're still seeking, and I quote, assurances from the Scottish Government. That, predict to me, is particularly uncertain for research funding in Scotland.
As we said before, there is no certainty.
There certainly isn't.
There is no certainty, but we are confident that whether the research income comes from research councils or from charities, that the research outcomes profit all the countries involved. So I very much see Wellcome Trust and others wanting to continue negotiate a common future with us. So I'm confident about that. But like with the previous question, the certainty is not there. But the arguments in terms of the outcomes we should use in order to negotiate.
And it's worth saying, as indeed was Professor Boyle said earlier, there is already a precedent in terms of the Wellcome Trust. They do fund research in the Republic of Ireland, which is obviously not part of the UK, although according to different principles. So it's not without precedent. I think perhaps an overall point to make in relation to all of this is that we would expect, and certainly I would expect, that it would be a Scottish Government objective to ensure that however all of this plays out, that there is a significant fund of research available for Scotland equal to or better than what is available now, because it has to be one of the objectives of Scotland in whatever constitutional configuration it finds itself, that it is able to make the same kind of impression globally in terms of research that it's able to do now. And that's important for all sorts of reasons, not just for the excellence and for the recognition of our universities, but also for our capacity as a country to attract inward investment of a high-value kind. So it is very important that that commitment is there. I believe it to be there, but it will be certainly not something we will be shy about calling for in the event of the post-referendum scenario coming in the way that we've been discussing.
I'll just go on to my third question. I think we're all with you there. No one could possibly disagree with you. But, you know, when we have an outcome that's not predictable and we're seeking affirmations and assurances, it does raise uncertainty. Professor Boyle, you were talking about pre-existing cross-border research areas. Well, my very good researcher scanned Google all over the place and he found one. Nordic Research Councils for the Humanities and Social Sciences with a budget of 13 million compared to the UK Research Council 3 billion. So can I just, I think you've sort of already answered it, but apart from this Nordic Research Council 13 million, is there anything else within the EU similar to that, apart from the charities?
I should clarify, and I'm fairly certain, although I'd need to double-check, but I'm fairly certain the example you've just given is not an example of a single research area.
Really?
This is an example...
I'll have to go back to my excellent research.
Yes, I mean, it is complicated, but this is an example similar to one I gave you that my organisation is involved in, where we do collaborate with other countries. Okay. As far as I understand it, the Nordic countries do have a system where they collaborate together on research funding proposals, but it's one small part of their overall national funding schemes. So it's not a single research area that encompasses all of their research.
There's no,
as far as I'm aware, there's no international precedent of a system that encompasses all of the research as we have now in the UK.
For different countries.
Maybe I'm not sure whether it is an example of it or not, but the example I gave earlier of the US-Ireland R&D partnership, which is for, despite the R&D label, is for academic institutions. I was involved in the establishment of that. In fact, I was a representative of one of the three representatives of the Irish government in the negotiations that established that. And one of the big questions that was raised at the time was whether each contributing country would only be able to draw as much out of it as they put in. And the decision was reached that would not be done, and that those making grant applications to the US-Ireland R&D partnership would be able to have those awarded on the basis of a peer review, regardless of how large the contribution of the contributing jurisdiction was, and that's how it's actually worked out. That doesn't create a single research area because it's specific to the particular scheme, but that said, it operates on the basis of a shared input and a shared shared outcome and has worked well, and the grants made by it are of a substantial size.
But it's not a single research area.
No, but it's a single research...
Professor Boyle disagreed with it.
I mean, I suppose it always depends what we mean by a single research area. In
Like
some
UK
respects, we don't actually have a single research area in the UK now, because the Scottish Funding Council operates research excellence grants separately from HEFGE for England and so on. So there is a single research element within what we have now, which is the UK Research Councils. Other elements are separate. So, for example, the innovation centres funded by the Scottish Government do not have a counterpart in the rest of the UK. So your question really, with respect, probably ought to be about, is there a single research scheme, not necessarily a single research area? And my answer to that is yes, there is an example of that.
Isn't the UK Research Funding, whatever your title is that not a single research area across the UK countries?
Yes, we currently have what we would describe in the terminology as a single research system, and that's a system that encompasses all of the different schemes. It encompasses infrastructure, capital funding, and a variety of other things. We can debate, there absolutely are examples across the world of organisations coming together and using things called virtual common pots, which is where they pay for their own researchers, or indeed common pots, where they do agree. But as I stated at the beginning, these are fairly rare, and they tend to be small proportions of a funding agency's overall portfolio. It would be very rare. In fact, I don't think there is a single example where two nations have shared their entire research funding, research council funding at the current time.
It's important, though, to point out that that funding is only part of our funding because of the dual support system that Ferdinand has referred to.
And indeed, there's funding from many other, there's funding from government departments, funding from business and various other activities. But it is true, I think it's 26% of the Scottish funding at the moment comes from research councils.
And that was really my point, that 26% is a common research system, but that leaves you with a substantial percentage that isn't. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Joan McAlpine.
Much. Professor von Prudzinski talked about the goodwill in the system, and Mrs Scanlon talked about charities. Certainly the work from my excellent researcher shows that there's a lot of goodwill coming from those charities as well. Simon Gillespie, the Chief Executive of the British Heart Foundation, has said we're committed to working across the four nations of the UK, whatever happens in Scotland. The Diabetes UK Chief Executive Barbara Young said our response to the outcome of the referendum will be driven by the needs of people living with diabetes in Scotland. And Cancer Research also said they would continue to work closely with the Scottish Government. You must take a lot of encouragement from that.
Yes, indeed. And of course, some of the charities that you could mention, of course, draw some of their income from Scotland, so it would be entirely in their interests to be seen to be continuing to contribute. I think I have, leaving aside from it, I might, with no disrespect to anyone here, call it sort of the political arguments, leaving that aside, in the system itself, that is to say, within the system, the academic system, universities, the research councils, all those who make up the actual operational parts of higher education, there is a very large amount of goodwill, and that includes charities, in it to seek an outcome that would be beneficial to all sides after any such vote, if it happens.
But then we need to look also at the fact that not all charities are UK-wide. There are lots of Scottish charities, and in the case of my university, for example, it is about 71% comes from Scottish charities, and the rest from UK charities.
That's interesting. And in terms of, these suggestions that somehow this crucial work in medical research might be damaged. It seems very strange if a professor at Dundee University is doing groundbreaking work on cancer research, for example, that anyone would think of turning away from that research with all the possibilities just because of a political change.
Yes, I agree with you. I cannot see that happen, but like I said before, there is no certainty. There is no certainty, but the research profits the whole of the UK and not just Dundee or Scotland.
Yeah. And finally, I wanted to ask about this whole issue of predictability. A few years ago, the UK government effectively withdrew all public funding from tuition in UK universities. I would have thought that was a huge shock to the system, probably eliminates anything that we could be talking about here today. You know, like within the UK system, there's a huge element of unpredictability depending on the ideology of your government.
I suppose it's fair to say that even within the constitutional arrangements we have now, we are less affected by that, although indirectly we are, as the last discussion, of course, would have illustrated. I think we have to be fair and say that you can never have a situation where you have complete predictability. We don't know what the economic climate is going to be in 5 years' time. We don't know what other countries are going to be doing that affect us. And so no matter what constitutional arrangement you're in or you might be striving towards, there isn't a complete predictability of what's going to happen. I think what we need to ensure is that the planning that's taking place takes account of the things that we believe may happen, and that we plan accordingly to ensure that the impact of that is as beneficial as possible. And that's really what University Scotland has been doing in its approach to this. It's set out the issues that could become issues one way or another, in fact, in the future, and then to make sure that we are prepared for those to the extent that we can be.
Claire Adamson.
Yeah, it was just clarification back to the Horizon 2020. We were talking about you know, cross-border funding areas. Is Horizon 2020 not an example of a pan-European funding pot that can be drawn down on?
Yes, it clearly is. It's not. I mean, Horizon 2020 is the latest iteration of a long-standing development of European research funding, the so-called framework programs, which have been around for quite a while, and which have always required that any successful applicant had to have partners in other member states. So the existence of a model of cross-border research funding through that has existed for some time, yes.
That, according to my researchers, that in terms of the framework programmes, Scotland has benefited from some €505 million over the last 7 years. So it's not an insubstantial amount of money that is being put into research in Scotland from the European Union.
It's a very substantial sum of money. The research funding of the European Union globally is really second only to US research funding, which still leads, and is a very significant source of funding. I remember when I was in Ireland when we had very little indigenous funding and we were almost entirely motoring on European funding and doing so very successfully, it has to be said. So yes, it's a long-standing, very substantial example of cross-border research funding.
It would be fair to say that in terms of research funding, what we have effectively is a mixed economy.
Yes.
Yes, that's absolutely true, but I would just draw attention to one or 2 points. Certainly, it is European funding, of course, is cross-border funding. I mean, it's a European organisation in a sense, so it's a little bit different to just sort of comparing that to nation states. I think that so I'm president of something called Science Europe, which represents 52 of the funding agencies across Europe. I think the most recent calculations are that something like 92% of the funding in Europe comes from the national funding organisations compared to the European funding. So, yes, it's true that the European funding is substantial, but the vast majority of funding comes from national agencies.
Well, indeed, but the point I was making was, and you said earlier, I think it was you that said the figure that 26% comes from the research councils in terms of the investment in research, which leaves 74%, which must be made up of a whole variety of other sources, yes, including EU money, charities,
yes, that's right,
UK charities, Scottish charities, Scottish government funding, and a whole raft of others, I'm sure, including other foundations, etc., that provide
absolutely
money. So it is my point about a mixed economy, I think, is a fair one.
Absolutely, I agree. It's a mixed economy, and certainly from a funding point of view, there are a range of different places that Scottish universities and UK universities get their funding. I mean, the European funding that comes into Scottish universities would be substantially less than the funding that comes in from the research councils currently, but you're right, it's a mixed event. There will be some funding that obviously would continue to need negotiation, so Scottish universities do quite well out of UK government funding at the moment, which of course would also need negotiation. And we've already talked about there'll be a number of charities who I presume would continue to want to support funding in Scotland. Absolutely. There'll be some like the Wellcome Trust that will want to negotiate in the same way that they negotiate with Ireland and other countries. So it is a mixed situation, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, coming back to the mixed economy, again, coming back to the dual support system, it is important that that bit of it that comes from Scottish Funding Council and the rest of it is attributed in a different way. And which happens in a country, whether it's independent or not, because that's part of our devolved system at the moment as well. So that is something which is stable.
Yes, thank you. Can I thank you all for, I know you've got some time limitations in terms of other commitments, so can I thank you for coming along this morning. We're most grateful for your time, and given that we've previously agreed that our final item on the agenda will be taken in private, I now close this part of the meeting to the public.